Okay, in this video, we're going to sort of elaborate on from crowding out and talk about some of the costs of deficits or the weaknesses deficits can have for our growth in both the short and the long term. So generally deficits are considered expansionary. What we're going to look at is why they can have a contractionary effect. And the short term is related to crowding out, the long term is related to other factors. So just in relation to crowding out, as I said, we talked about this in the last video, but these are the basic steps that if you can get your head around, then you can answer these questions quite well. So we have a budget deficit. You might want to use the term that expenses exceed revenue. Therefore, we need to borrow to fund that deficit. Therefore, the banks have less liquidity. They have less money because we're borrowing from the banks. The banks raise their interest rates because of the increased demand for their funds. This flows on to less consumption and investment spending throughout the economy. Because higher interest rates discourage spending and investment. The higher interest rates also attract capital inflow, so foreign investors seek a better return on their investments. That leads to a higher Australian dollar, and that crowds out the external sector, because the higher Australian dollar then leads to less exports and more imports. So if you're using this is probably the best slide to use for revision purposes, and then you sort of just elaborate on each step. Just be mindful that the extent to which a budget deficit crowds out the private or external sector depends on who we borrow from. So if we sell government bonds to the private sector mainly, then it'll cause more of an impact on interest rates. If the people that purchase the bonds overseas are from overseas, then that will have more of an impact on the Australian dollar but won't change interest rates. So the greater the extent that we finance our debt by borrowing from overseas, the bigger the impact it has on crowding out of the external sector rather than the private sector. So what I mean by that is, let's say a government had a $50 billion deficit. Again, explain that means that they're spending more as a government than they're receiving, more expenditure than revenue. If they borrow from the private sector, the problem with that is it will increase interest rates and will attract capital inflow because the higher interest rates act as an incentive for people to invest in Australia. But that might only attract, say, $10 billion of capital inflow. So of the $50 billion deficit, it hasn't had a massive impact on the dollar because most of it's been financed domestically, or it's all been financed domestically, and the dollar's just appreciated a little bit because of the fact that there's been increased capital inflow. So the Australian dollar will appreciate a little bit, but most of the crowding out would be of the private sector. If we borrow from overseas, the whole $50 billion will be capital inflow, so we have to borrow that full $50 billion amount. That will cause a larger crowding out of the external sector. So interest rates won't change much in Australia, but because we're borrowing all of that money from overseas, it will have a big impact on the Australian dollar and will crowd out the overseas sector more so than the Australian sector or the private sector. Okay, in relation to other problems with budget deficits, so we've looked at it can cause crowding out in the short term, which can have a contractionary effect, even though most of the impact in the short term will be expansionary because we're lowering taxes, we're trying to increase welfare and so on and so forth. But there can be problems in the long term for our growth if the bigger budget deficits lead to more government debt over time. So some of the problems that can exist is that it can lead to a degrading of our credit rating. So Australia has a AAA credit rating. If that gets downgraded, we may have to pay more on our foreign debt, on government debt, which could lead to higher interest rates. It may also lead to the idea of foreign investors not lending to Australia at all. So we don't have that money for infrastructure, we don't have that money for government spending on welfare and so on and so forth. It can also lead to higher interest repayments if we have more debt by nature, even if interest rates stay the same. If it's 3%, of a bigger figure, so if the government's in $300 billion of debt, then they have to pay more interest on that debt, which leaves less money to spend in productive areas like education and welfare and health and so on and so forth. That's another problem that can exist purely based on the fact that they're paying more interest. So at the moment, the government spends about $20 billion on interest. That's $20 billion they don't have to spend on these more productive areas of the economy. Other problems with deficits, it reduces the ability to deal with future crises. So if we have a large amount of government debt, the government has less capacity to borrow. So I talk a fair bit about in class about during the GFC, the government was able to implement stimulus packages. They gave everyone $900. They spent so much money on the education reforms. That stuff couldn't exist if the government didn't have the money or didn't have the finances to actually fuel that investment. So right now, if we had a crisis, the government couldn't afford to be as expansionary because they're in so much debt. So it's important to recognise that it reduces their ability to stimulate our economy during troughs. And finally, and this is the one that I would definitely talk about as a potential cost in the future, further deficits may need to be reined in. We may be looking to reduce our debt, so similar to what's happening in Greece, and therefore we may have to employ austerity measures. So we may have to employ higher taxes. We may have to reduce government spending. And all of this will lead to less employment and less growth, which can jeopardise the living standards of future generations. So this idea of austerity measures get put in place. It's harder to deal with future crises. Our credit rating may fall, and more of the government's finances will be dedicated towards paying off interest. So the aim of budget deficits, we want to deliver deficits that achieve our short to medium goals. So we want to prevent troughs, we want to prevent recessions, but we want to do so without imposing too big a burden on the future. So when we are in a trough, we accept that we're going to run budget deficits. We have to try and expand growth, but we want to achieve them without having too big of a burden on future generations. So deficits in the short term can lead to a long-term slowdown if it means we have to reduce expenditure and raise taxes. Thank you.